Deep in the heart of the jungle, where nature reigns supreme and mankind is but a fleeting visitor, an extraordinary story unfolded. The air was thick with mist, the scent of damp earth mixing with the calls of unseen creatures. Towering trees stood like ancient guardians, their branches intertwined to form a canopy so dense that only slivers of sunlight dared to break through. Here, among the tangled vines and whispering leaves, life moved to its own rhythm, untouched and untamed. In this world of wild beauty and lurking danger, a story of trust, courage, and an unbreakable bond was about to be written, one that defied the very laws of nature itself. It was a story that began with a girl, one who did not fear the jungle but felt it call to her, like a forgotten lullaby, pulling her deeper into its mysteries. The jungle was alive with sound, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant roar of something powerful. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped carefully over the damp earth, her bare feet sinking slightly into the soft mud. She had wandered farther than ever before, deeper into the unknown, drawn by an invisible force. The trees stood tall around her, their thick roots twisting like the fingers of an ancient giant gripping the land. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the canopy, but the shadows between them held secrets, watching, waiting. A sudden movement made her freeze. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the undergrowth, deep and primal. Her breath hitched as her eyes darted between the dense foliage. Then, out of the shadows, it appeared. A massive silverback gorilla, his dark fur blending into the jungle, his broad chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. His black eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity, warning, or perhaps something deeper. He was enormous, his sheer presence radiating raw power. The earth beneath him seemed to tremble as he took a slow step forward. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run. Every story she had ever heard told her that standing before a wild beast like this was a death sentence. But something held her there. Her pulse raced, yet she willed herself to stay still. She reached into the small woven pouch slung across her shoulder, her fingers closing around the ripe fruit she had brought. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand, palm open, offering it forward. The gorilla's nostrils flared, his dark eyes flicking between her face and the fruit. A tense silence stretched between them, thick as the jungle air. He took another step closer. The ground shook slightly under his weight. Lena held her breath as he reached out. His enormous hand, rough and leathery, dwarfed her own. For a moment, he hesitated, as if deciding whether to accept her offering or swat it away. Then, with surprising gentleness, his fingers curled around the fruit, lifting it from her palm. He studied it for a moment before bringing it to his mouth, chewing slowly, his gaze never leaving her. A wave of relief washed over her, but she dared not move. She had seen something in his eyes, something more than wild instinct, understanding, recognition. The jungle had always been a place of untamed power, where the rules of man held no weight. But in that moment, Lena realized something profound. She was no longer just a visitor. She had been seen, acknowledged, and in the depths of the jungle, under the watchful eyes of its greatest guardian, the first spark of trust had been lit. Day after day, Lena returned to the jungle. She no longer felt like an outsider, but she understood the delicate balance she had to maintain. The gorilla, whom she had started calling Kanoa, was still unpredictable, still wild, but he no longer saw her as a threat. At first, she kept her distance, sitting on a moss-covered rock and watching him from afar. He would glance at her, his dark eyes studying her every move, but he never chased her away. Each time, she brought fruit, carefully placing it on the ground before stepping back. Slowly, cautiously, he would approach, his massive hands picking up the offering, his gaze never leaving her. It wasn't long before Kanoa's curiosity grew. He began to inch closer, testing her presence. Lena noticed the small details, the way he tilted his head when she spoke softly, the way his nostrils flared when she moved too quickly. She had learned to mimic his gestures, lowering her gaze when he huffed, staying still when he watched her closely. And then, one day, something incredible happened. Lena was sitting cross-legged on the forest floor, sketching in her worn notebook. She had drawn Kanoa many times before, trying to capture the way the light played against his fur, the quiet intelligence in his eyes. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice him moving until she felt a shadow pass over her. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. He was standing just a few feet away. He wasn't just watching her, he was studying her, just as she had studied him. Slowly, deliberately, Kanoa reached out, picking up a branch from the ground. He held it for a moment, then extended it toward her. Lena hesitated, unsure of what to do. Was it a warning? A test? But then she saw the way he looked at her, calm, expectant. With a trembling hand, she took the branch from him. A strange warmth spread through her chest as she realized what had just happened. It was an offering, a sign of trust. He was communicating with her in his own way. From that moment on, their bond deepened. Kanoa allowed her to sit closer, even to move beside him as he rested in the shade. Sometimes, he would mimic her movements, tilting his head when she did, scratching his arm when she scratched hers. Once, she laughed at something silly, a butterfly landing on her nose, and to her surprise, Kanoa let out a deep, rumbling sound that almost sounded like a chuckle. She had never imagined that a creature so powerful could also be so gentle. But the jungle was still the jungle, and trust was fragile. Lena knew that one wrong move, one moment of overstepping her bounds, could shatter everything they had built. Still, as she sat beside Kanoa, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, she couldn't help but believe that something extraordinary was happening. She had stepped into his world, and against all odds, he had let her stay. The jungle was never truly silent, but that day, an eerie stillness settled over the trees. Lena felt it before she saw anything, an uneasy shift in the air, a tension humming beneath the usual symphony of rustling leaves and distant calls. Kanoa sat nearby, lazily plucking at the vines, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each slow breath. But then he stopped. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. A low, guttural sound rumbled from his chest. Lena's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the jungle, followed by a deep, agonized roar. Lena's blood ran cold. She jumped to her feet, heart pounding as Kanoa bolted upright, his entire body tensed like a coiled spring. Without thinking, she ran, pushing past thick ferns and tangled roots, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. Then she saw it. Kanoa's leg was caught in a thick steel snare. The cruel metal teeth had clamped around his flesh, digging deep. He roared again, thrashing wildly, trying to free himself. Lena had never seen him like this before. His powerful body writhing in pain, his massive fists slamming into the ground, uprooting plants in a desperate fury. Her hands trembled as she took a hesitant step forward. He turned to her, his eyes wild and full of rage. For the first time since she had met him, she felt fear. This was no longer the gentle creature who had offered her a branch, who had chuckled at her laughter. This was raw, untamed fury, a beast in pain, cornered, unpredictable. He let out a warning snarl, his sharp teeth bared, his muscles trembling with the effort to break free. Lena swallowed hard. She could run. She could go back to the village, get help. But help would come too late. She knew that. And she knew something else, something terrifying and certain. If she left now, their bond would be broken forever. Her hands balled into fists. No, she couldn't let that happen. Stepping closer, she reached out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kanoa, it's me." The gorilla's breath came in ragged huffs, his entire body quivering. But he didn't lunge at her. His wild eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment there was something there, recognition, buried beneath the pain. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the damp earth seeping into her clothes. Her fingers fumbled with the snare, her pulse hammering in her ears. The metal was tight, biting into his flesh, and every time she pulled at it, he let out another agonized growl. "I know it hurts," she murmured. "Just a little longer." His massive hands clenched into fists, but he didn't strike. He didn't push her away. He let her stay. With one final tug, the snare came loose. Kanoa roared, jerking backward, his injured leg collapsing beneath him. Lena scrambled away, her chest heaving. For a terrifying moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, his breath still ragged but steady. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. He didn't attack, he didn't run. Instead, he let out a deep, rumbling exhale and lowered his head ever so slightly. Lena let out a shaking breath of her own. She had saved him. And against all odds, he knew it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the jungle floor. The air was thick with tension, a stillness that felt unnatural. Lena walked carefully beside Kanoa, his injured leg slowing his usual powerful strides. He was hurt, but he was free. And for now, that was enough. Then, a sound shattered the quiet. The snap of a twig. Lena froze. So did Kanoa. His ears twitched, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. A second later, another noise. Whispered voices, footsteps pressing into the undergrowth, and then the glint of metal. Lena barely had time to react before the poachers stepped into view. 3 men, dressed in dark, earth-stained clothes, rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them carried a coil of rope. The other held a tranquilizer dart, its needle gleaming in the fading light. "Well, well," one of them sneered. "Looks like we caught ourselves a prize." Kanoa let out a deep, threatening growl, stepping in front of Lena. His massive body was tense, his muscles rippling with barely contained fury. But he was hurt and outnumbered. Lena's heart pounded. She had to think fast. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "He's not a threat." The man with the dart gun chuckled. "Not yet." In one swift motion, he raised the gun. Lena barely had time to shout before the poachers moved. One of them lunged forward, trying to throw the rope around Kanoa's injured leg. Kanoa roared, swinging his massive arm, knocking the man off his feet. The others rushed in. Chaos erupted, shouts, the thud of boots against the earth, Kanoa's furious growls echoing through the trees. Lena didn't think. She acted. Darting forward, she grabbed a handful of dirt and flung it into the nearest poacher's eyes. He cursed, stumbling back, giving Kanoa just enough time to charge. His powerful arms slammed into the second man, sending him crashing into the underbrush. But then, a loud pop. Kanoa let out a strangled roar and staggered. The tranquilizer dart had struck him just below the shoulder. "No!" Lena screamed, her voice raw with panic. Kanoa swayed, his massive body struggling against the drug now coursing through his veins. The remaining poacher smirked, reloading his weapon. Lena knew she had one chance, one final moment to save him. Without hesitation, she threw herself in front of Kanoa, arms spread wide. "Stop!" she shouted. "You'll have to go through me first." The poacher hesitated, and then a new sound, a rustling from the trees, growing louder. A moment later, figures emerged from the jungle. Villagers, dozens of them. Some carried tools, others simple wooden clubs, their faces set with quiet fury. The poachers exchanged uneasy glances. Outnumbered, the tables had turned. "Leave," one of the villagers growled. "Now." The poachers didn't need to be told twice. With one last hateful glance at Kanoa, they turned and disappeared into the jungle. Lena barely had time to turn before Kanoa collapsed. She rushed to his side, pressing a hand against his heaving chest. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, met hers. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." As the villagers surrounded them, helping to lift Kanoa's massive frame, Lena let out a shaky breath. She had risked everything, and she had won. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The jungle was never the same after that day. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the village. How Lena had stood between a wild beast and danger. How she had saved the life of a creature feared by many. Some called her reckless. Others whispered that she had been touched by the spirit of the jungle itself. But Lena didn't care about the stories. All that mattered was Kanoa. For days she stayed by his side. The villagers helped as best they could, bringing herbs and water, but there was only so much they could do. He needed rest. The tranquilizer had left him weak, and his leg, though free from the trap, was still healing. He could barely move at first, his massive body drained of its usual strength. Yet even in his weakest moments, his eyes would always find Lena, as if reassuring her that he was still there, still fighting. She brought him food every day, sitting with him in the quiet shade of the jungle, speaking to him in soft whispers. He couldn't understand her words, but he understood her presence. That was enough. Sometimes he would lift his heavy arm just slightly, brushing his fingers against the earth in a slow, deliberate motion. A gesture of trust, a reminder that their bond had not been broken. One morning, as the mist clung low to the ground and the golden light of dawn painted the trees, Kanoa finally stood. It was slow, shaky, but he was standing. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she watched him take a step, then another. He turned to her, and for the first time in days, she saw something familiar in his eyes: strength, determination. She smiled. "You're back." The jungle around them had been silent, as if waiting. And now it seemed to come alive once more, the distant calls of birds filling the air, the rustling of leaves whispering through the trees. It was as if the forest itself had been holding its breath for this moment. But Lena knew what this meant. He was healing, and soon he would leave. The thought sat heavy in her chest. Kanoa belonged to the wild, to the world beyond human hands. No matter how strong their bond had become, he was never meant to stay by her side. She had always known that. But knowing didn't make it any easier. A few days later, the moment came. Kanoa stood at the edge of the clearing, his dark silhouette framed against the towering trees. He turned back one last time, his deep, intelligent eyes meeting hers. There was no fear, no hesitation, only understanding. Lena swallowed hard, forcing herself to smile. "Go on," she whispered. For a moment, he didn't move. And then, with one last lingering glance, he turned and disappeared into the jungle. Lena stood there long after he was gone, listening to the sounds of the wild, knowing that somewhere, out there, Kanoa was free. And in her heart, she knew this wasn't goodbye. The jungle had brought them together once. Maybe, one day, it would again. The days passed, but the jungle never felt the same without him. Lena still wandered through the towering trees, listening to the rustling leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. But there was an emptiness now, a quiet absence that only she seemed to notice. Every morning, she found herself glancing toward the clearing where Kanoa had once rested, half expecting to see his massive form waiting for her. But he was gone. And that was how it was meant to be. The villagers spoke of her often now, their voices filled with wonder and curiosity. Some called her the Gorilla Girl, a legend among the trees, the only human to ever form a bond with a wild silverback. Children would gather around, wide-eyed, begging her to tell the story of how she had tamed the heart of the beast. But Lena never saw it that way. She hadn't tamed Kanoa. He had chosen to trust her. That was something far greater. Still, deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, would she ever see him again? Seasons changed and life in the village moved on. But Lena never forgot. She still visited the jungle, still left small offerings of fruit at the base of the old tree where they had first met. Sometimes she would sit and close her eyes, listening, hoping. Then, one day, everything changed. It was early morning when she heard it, a deep, familiar rumble in the distance. Her heart leaped into her throat. She turned toward the sound, barely daring to believe it. And then, through the shifting shadows, he emerged. Kanoa. He was bigger now, stronger. His fur gleamed in the golden light, his movements steady and sure. But his eyes, those same dark, intelligent eyes, were just as she remembered. Lena's breath caught. Kanoa. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, as if testing the space between them, the time that had passed. And then, slowly, Kanoa took a step forward. He wasn't alone. From behind him, a smaller figure appeared, a young gorilla, barely half Kanoa's size. Its eyes were wide, filled with curiosity and caution as it clung to Kanoa's side. Lena's heart swelled as realization struck her. Kanoa had found a family. A warm smile spread across her lips. She didn't move closer, didn't try to reach out. She didn't need to. He had come back, not as the wounded creature she had once saved, but as a leader, as a protector. And he had wanted her to see. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart. "I never doubted you," she whispered. Kanoa let out a deep exhale, a sound that almost felt like an answer. Then, with one last glance, he turned and disappeared into the trees once more, his new companion following close behind. Lena watched until they were gone, a quiet peace settling over her. He was where he belonged, and so was she. The jungle had brought them together once, and now it had given them both something even greater: understanding, respect, and the unbreakable bond of a friendship that neither time nor distance could ever erase.